Emmy Nakamura woke to the smell of bacon, American bacon sizzling in a cast iron skillet somewhere beyond the converted barn walls. November 1945, Wyoming. 5 months since Hiroshima, 3 months since capture, and in her right hand, hidden beneath a thin blanket, she clutched the small glass vial her commanding officer had given her the day their ship was boarded. Potassium cyanide enough to kill in 30 seconds. Die with honor rather than live in shame, Lieutenant Sato had whispered. But Lieutenant Sato had not known that the enemy would smell like breakfast. That the man who lost his brother at Guadalcanal would be the one frying bacon at 5 in the morning. That the choice between honor and shame would become infinitely more complicated when the enemy stopped acting like an enemy. This is not a story of war. It is about what happens when war ends, but hatred has not. And when the only way forward requires betraying everything you were taught to believe. The military transport truck had rumbled along the rutted dirt road toward Harper Ranch on November 9th, 1945, carrying 37 Japanese women who had no idea where they were being taken or what would happen when they arrived. Emmy pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching glimpses of a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. Endless brown prairie stretched toward distant mountains. Nothing like the green islands and coastal cities of Japan. The vastness of it made her feel impossibly small. The women had been captured 3 months earlier during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific War. Most had served as communications specialists, translators, or administrative support for Imperial Japanese naval operations in the Philippines and Okinawa. They were not combat soldiers, but they wore uniforms and had taken oaths of service. When American forces overran their positions, they had expected execution. Instead, they found themselves on ship bound for the American mainland and processed through facilities in California and now transported to this remote location that seemed designed to make them disappear from the world entirely. Keiko Sato sat beside Emmy in the truck, her 32 years of life etched into the lines around her eyes. She had been a naval translator, fluent in English, from her education at a Christian missionary school before the war. Now she whispered translations of the guards' occasional comments, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly how precarious their situation was. "This looks like the end of the world," Keiko murmured in Japanese. Emmy nodded but said nothing. Her hand found the vial in her left pocket, the one Lieutenant Sato had pressed into her palm during those final moments on the ship. The weight of it had become familiar over the past 93 days. Every morning she woke and thought, today I will use it. Every night she lay down, having failed to keep that promise to herself. Colonel Catherine Wade stood waiting as the truck pulled up to the converted barn. She was one of only 3 women in the military administration of the entire Wyoming region, a fact that had made her the obvious choice for this unprecedented assignment. The Army had no protocol for housing female enemy prisoners. Male POW camps dotted the American landscape, holding thousands of Germans and Italians. But Japanese women prisoners were rare enough that standard procedures simply did not exist. Beside Colonel Wade stood Daniel Harper, 34 years old, ranch foreman, never married. His weathered hands turned his hat in slow circles, a nervous habit he had developed during the 2 years since his brother Billy died at Guadalcanal. Behind him, his mother Martha waited with the stillness of someone who had learned to contain grief within a body that refused to break under its weight. She was 62 years old. She had buried a son. She had every reason to hate the women climbing down from that truck. The women descended with rigid military bearing, their dark hair pinned severely, their threadbare naval auxiliary uniforms still worn with pride despite months of captivity. Emmy was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. She had joined the Naval Communications Corps in 1943, believing the propaganda that Japan was fighting a defensive war against Western aggression. Now her country lay in ruins. 2 cities vaporized by weapons that seemed to come from nightmare rather than reality. And she stood in enemy territory with no idea if anyone from her family had survived. The cold Wyoming wind hit her face, carrying smells she did not recognize. Sage and cattle and something else. something that would take her weeks to identify as the particular scent of high prairie grassland in late autumn. The ground beneath her boots was frozen hard. The sky stretched overhead in a blue so deep and clear it hurt to look at directly. Everything here was so open, so exposed. In Yokohama, buildings had pressed close together. Streets had wound narrow and intimate. Here there was nowhere to hide. Keiko stepped forward as the senior ranking member of their group. She addressed Colonel Wade in careful formal English, requesting information about their status and treatment. The colonel's response was professional but not unkind. They would be housed in the converted barn, provided with adequate food and clothing, and expected to follow camp regulations. Beyond that, she admitted the situation remained unclear. The first 3 weeks passed in frozen silence. The converted barn had been divided into sleeping quarters, a common area, and a small kitchen facility. The women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, speaking only in whispered Japanese when absolutely necessary. They lined up for meals with military precision, ate without complaint, and returned to their quarters to sit in rigid posture on their cots. At night, Emmy could hear muffled crying from various corners of the barn. But by morning, every face was once again a mask of stoic dignity. The ranch hands assigned to guard duty were unprepared for this kind of responsibility. Jack Harper, Daniel's younger brother by 3 years, had expected to spend the war years working the family ranch. He was 31, too old for the first draft calls, too essential to agriculture for the later ones. Now he found himself carrying a rifle he had no intention of using, watching over women who seemed more frightened of him than he was of them. He and the other hands rotated guard shifts with uncomfortable uncertainty. Old Jim Patterson had worked the Harper land for 40 years. He was 64 years old and had never imagined he would be a jailer. Young Tommy Chen was 19, too young to have been drafted before the war ended and completely bewildered by the entire situation. None of them spoke Japanese. None of them knew what to do with 37 enemy women who refused to make eye contact and flinched whenever a man approached too quickly. Emmy watched the guards carefully trying to reconcile the propaganda she had absorbed with the reality before her eyes. These men looked nothing like the demons from the posters back home. They looked tired. They looked like farmers and ranchers who wanted to be anywhere but here. Jack Harper was barely older than her youngest brother Takeshi, who had died at Okinawa. The similarity made her chest tighten every time she saw him. Colonel Wade visited twice weekly, inspecting conditions and attempting to establish some kind of rapport with the prisoners. She brought newspapers all in English, which Keiko translated for the others. The news was devastating. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his divine voice heard by common people for the first time, telling them the war was lost. Cities across Japan had been burned to ash by American firebombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki no longer existed. The women listened to these translations in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of their nation's defeat. Amy thought about her family in Yokohama. Her parents had been planning to visit relatives in Hiroshima in early August. She had no way of knowing if they had gone, no way of knowing if they were alive, no way of knowing anything except that the world she had known was gone and she was trapped in this impossible place with people who should be her enemies, but mostly just looked confused. The ranch itself stretched across thousands of acres of Wyoming grassland, bordered by mountains that turned purple in the evening light. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way that made Emmy's heart ache. She had grown up near the sea where cherry trees bloomed pink each spring and the smell of salt water mixed with city smoke. This endless brown prairie felt like exile to the edge of existence. Every morning, Emmy woke and felt for the vial in her pocket. Every morning, she thought about Lieutenant Sato's final order. Every morning, she chose to wait just one more day. She did not know why. Perhaps because the guards had not killed them yet. Perhaps because the food, though strange, was adequate. Perhaps because some stubborn part of her refused to die in a place where no one would know her name or understand what she had been before the war tried to make her into something else. On December 3rd, 1945, Jack Harper noticed Emmy drawing in the dirt. It was purely by accident. He was walking the fence line of the compound during his afternoon guard rotation when he saw her kneeling in a sheltered corner near the barn's south wall. She was drawing with a stick, her movements precise and deliberate. Jack stopped keeping his distance so as not to startle her and watched. The woman was creating an intricate image of a horse capturing its form with just a few elegant lines in the dust. The skill was unmistakable. He had grown up around ranchers who could rope and ride and fix machinery, but he had never seen anyone create beauty with such economy of motion. Emmy sensed his presence and froze her hand still holding the stick. She had been so absorbed in the drawing that she had forgotten to maintain her careful awareness of the guard's positions. Now she waited for reprimand for the stick to be taken away, for some punishment she could not predict. Her fingers tightened around the wood. The pill in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. Instead, Jack Harper did something that would later seem like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a flood of human connection. He walked slowly to the supply shed, retrieved a stub of pencil and several sheets of paper, and brought them to her. He set them on the ground a respectful distance away, nodded once, and returned to his post. Emmy stared at the paper and pencil as if they might be a trap. She looked up at the guard, but he had his back turned, apparently watching the horizon. Slowly, so slowly, she reached out and picked up the pencil. The weight of it in her hand felt like holding a piece of her former life. Before the war, she had studied calligraphy and ink painting with her grandmother. Art had been her refuge, her way of making sense of beauty in a world that increasingly made no sense at all. Her grandmother had taught her that every stroke mattered, that patience and precision could transform blank space into meaning. Those lessons had sustained Emmy through the strict routines of naval service, through the fear of capture, through the long voyage to America. But she had not held a pencil since the day her ship was boarded. That evening, Keiko approached Emmy with curiosity about the paper she was carefully concealing under her thin mattress. When Emmy explained what had happened, Keiko's expression shifted through several emotions. Suspicion first, then confusion, then something that might have been cautious hope. "Why would a guard give gifts to a prisoner?" Keiko asked in whispered Japanese. "What does he expect in return?" Emmy insisted there had been no demand, no suggestion of obligation, just paper and pencil given and received in silence. But even as she said it, she wondered, what did the American want? Was this kindness or manipulation? Was there a difference? Over the following days, Jack noticed that the woman used the paper sparingly, as if it were precious beyond measure. She would draw for only a few minutes each afternoon, always in that same sheltered spot. He began to recognize her among the group, the slight young woman with careful hands and eyes that seemed to carry an ocean of sadness. He did not know her name, he did not know her story, but he knew what it looked like when someone needed a small piece of normalcy in a world turned upside down. His brother Billy had written letters from the European front before being transferred to the Pacific. Those letters had described how small comforts mattered more than anything. A dry pair of socks, a letter from home, a moment of quiet. Billy had written that in the chaos of war, the smallest acts of human decency became magnified into something approaching grace. Jack had kept those letters. He read them sometimes when he could not sleep, trying to understand what his brother had experienced, trying to make sense of why Billy had died and he had lived. The Wyoming winter arrived with brutal efficiency on December 15th. The temperature plummeted overnight, and the women woke to find frost coating the inside of the barn windows. Their thin naval uniforms and the single blanket each had been issued were woefully inadequate. Emmy shivered so violently during morning roll call that her teeth chattered audibly. Around her, the other women wrapped their arms around themselves, trying to preserve body heat through sheer will. None of them complained. Complaining would show weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Daniel Harper stood with Colonel Wade during that morning inspection, and even his weathered rancher's face showed concern. These women might be enemy prisoners, but letting them freeze to death was not something his conscience would tolerate. By noon, he had made a decision that would require bending several regulations. He ordered his ranch hands to distribute additional blankets from the ranch's own supplies, along with heavy wool socks and extra undershirts that had been destined for donation to returning soldiers. When Colonel Wade raised an eyebrow at this unauthorized generosity, Daniel simply said that frozen prisoners could not work and the Army had specified the women should contribute labor to offset the cost of their maintenance. The arrival of the additional supplies created a moment of confusion among the women. They gathered in the common area as Jack and two other ranch hands brought in armloads of blankets and clothing. Keiko stepped forward to receive the items, her face carefully neutral, but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the first blanket. It was thick and warm and smelled faintly of cedar and livestock. It smelled like survival. The women distributed the supplies among themselves with quiet efficiency, each receiving 2 blankets and warm underclothing. That night, for the first time since their arrival, the sound of crying from the dark corners of the barn was replaced by the sound of sleep. But the cold taught them more than just the value of wool blankets. It taught them that survival in Wyoming required knowledge they did not possess. The ranch hands, watching the women struggle with the wood stove in their quarters, began offering instruction. Old Jim Patterson showed them how to properly stack wood for efficient burning, how to bank a fire to last through the night, how to dress in layers to trap warmth. His demonstrations were wordless at first, just slow, careful movements that the women could observe and imitate. But Keiko, recognizing an opportunity, began to translate the old man's occasional comments and to ask questions on behalf of the group. Her English, rusty from disuse and never perfectly fluent, became the bridge between two groups of people who had every reason to remain strangers. She asked about the strange dry cold of the high plains, so different from the humid winters of coastal Japan. Jim explained about altitude and moisture, about how the thin air could deceive you into thinking you were warmer than you were. His voice was patient, the voice of a man who had spent his life teaching younger ranch hands the skills they needed to survive. He did not seem to care that his current students had recently been classified as enemy combatants. January 1st, 1946 carried different meanings for the Japanese women and their American captors, but both groups felt the weight of it. For the women, the traditional Shigatsu celebration marked the most important holiday of the year, a time for family, for reflection, for welcoming good fortune. This year they faced it in captivity, separated from everything familiar, uncertain whether their families even existed anymore. Emmy woke before dawn and performed a private ritual she had learned from her grandmother. She bathed as thoroughly as the limited facilities allowed, put on the cleanest clothing she possessed, and sat in meditation facing east toward the homeland she might never see again. Around her, other women engaged in their own observances, creating makeshift altars from folded paper and carefully arranged stones. There was no special food, no sake, no mochi rice cakes, no red decorations. But there was intention, and sometimes intention was enough. Daniel Harper had been watching the women's subdued preparations with curiosity. He asked Keiko about the significance of the day, and she explained as best she could in her careful English. The new year was about renewal, she said, about leaving behind the old and welcoming the new, about honoring ancestors and hoping for blessings. Daniel listened thoughtfully, then disappeared into the ranch house. He returned an hour later with his mother following behind, carrying a large pot of black-eyed peas and cornbread, traditional Southern New Year's food that Daniel's Louisiana grandmother had brought to Wyoming decades earlier. Martha Harper was a formidable woman, weathered by ranch life, but unbent by its hardships. She had lost one son to the Pacific War, killed at Guadalcanal in November 1943. She had every reason to hate these Japanese women. Instead, she saw them clearly for what they were. Young women far from home, grieving their own losses, trapped by circumstances they had not created. She set the food down in the common area and spoke in her direct way. "In my family, we eat this on New Year's for good luck and prosperity. I figure we could all use some of that this year." The moment hung suspended between acceptance and rejection. Then Keiko bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Other women followed her lead. Martha, uncomfortable with the formality, waved her hand dismissively and began serving portions onto the mismatched plates the facility provided. The women ate cautiously at first, unfamiliar with the flavors, but hunger and the gesture behind the gift made the strange food acceptable. Some even found they enjoyed it. Emmy thought the black-eyed peas had a texture similar to Japanese beans, though the seasoning was entirely different. The cornbread was sweet and crumbly, nothing like rice but satisfying in its own way. As she ate, Emmy felt something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself since capture. These people, these Americans who should be her enemies, were feeding her on the most important day of the year, sharing their own traditions as if her traditions mattered, as if she mattered. That night, she took the vial from her pocket and looked at it for a long time. The glass was cold against her palm. Inside, the pills rattled softly when she shook it. Lieutenant Sato's voice echoed in her memory. Die with honor rather than live in shame. But what was honorable about dying when people were trying to keep you alive? What was shameful about accepting kindness from those who had no obligation to give it? She did not throw the vial away. Not yet. But she placed it in her trunk instead of keeping it in her pocket. A small change, but significant. Tomorrow, she told herself, if tomorrow is unbearable, then I will use it. But tonight I will sleep under warm blankets that my enemy gave me, and I will not apologize for being grateful. April arrived with warmth in the impossible green of new grass pushing through the brown prairie. On April 12, 1946, a mild spring morning, Emmy stood in the converted barn with the other women staring at Daniel Harper with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The tall cowboy shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his weathered hands turning his hat in nervous circles. Behind Emmy, 36 other women had stopped their morning chores to witness what would become one of the most unexpected conversations in the history of wartime captivity. Daniel Harper had just asked them to teach him and his ranch hands how to make sushi. The request hung as the cold Wyoming air, like something from a fever dream. Emmy's English had improved dramatically over the winter months, but surely she had misunderstood. She glanced at Keiko, whose dark eyes reflected the same bewilderment. They had prepared themselves for many things when they were captured in the Pacific Theater. Interrogation, harsh treatment, even execution in those first terrifying days. They had not prepared for American cowboys politely requesting lessons in traditional Japanese cuisine. Daniel seemed to sense their confusion. He explained in a slow, careful way that he had been reading about Japanese culture in a magazine from Denver. The article had described sushi and other traditional foods, and it had made him curious. More than that, he said he wanted to understand the women who had been living on his family's ranch for nearly half a year. He wanted to know who they really were beyond the designation of enemy prisoners. The other ranch hands stood behind him, young men and older cowboys alike, their faces showing genuine interest rather than mockery. Emmy found herself unable to respond. The absurdity of the moment was overwhelming. Here they stood, women who had served the Imperial Japanese Navy captured during the final desperate months of the war, now being asked to share their culture with the very men who guarded them. The Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly beyond the barn doors, so unlike the rice paddies and coastal villages of their homeland. And this American, this cowboy with dirt under his fingernails and kindness in his weathered face, wanted to learn about sushi in Wyoming, in landlocked, beef-eating rodeo-loving Wyoming. But as Emmy looked around at her fellow prisoners, she saw something unexpected in their expressions. Not just confusion, but something else. Interest, perhaps even the faintest hint of hope. They had lost so much. Their country, their families, their identities as soldiers of a defeated empire. Maybe, just maybe, sharing something of themselves could help them remember who they had been before the war, convince them they were something else entirely. Keiko stepped forward, her role as translator, making her the natural spokesperson. She explained in careful English that sushi was indeed a traditional food, but it required specific ingredients. Ocean fish, particular varieties of seaweed, specially prepared rice wasabi root, pickled ginger, most of which did not exist in Wyoming. Daniel listened to the list of impossibilities and nodded slowly. Then he asked a different question, one that would change the trajectory of all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Could you create something similar using what is available, he asked. Could you adapt your traditions to this new place? Teach us about Japanese culture even in its modified form. The question hung in the air, and Emmy suddenly understood what he was really asking. He was offering them a chance to be teachers instead of prisoners, to share instead of simply receive. He was acknowledging that they possessed knowledge and skills worth learning, that their culture had value beyond the war that had consumed it. After a long silence, Keiko spoke. "We would be honored to try." Daniel's face broke into a genuine smile. Martha appeared in the barn doorway, having overheard the conversation. She nodded her approval. Jack caught Emmy's eye across the space and gave a slight smile, the same expression he wore when Rosie learned a new command. That night, Emmy sat on her cot in the quiet barn, thinking about the impossibility of what they had agreed to do. Sushi in Wyoming, teaching their captors about the culture of the people they had defeated. It should have felt like betrayal. It should have felt like surrender. Instead, it felt like the first time since capture that someone had asked her to be herself. Not a prisoner, not a defeated soldier, not a faceless enemy, just Emmy, who knew how to shape rice with her hands and arrange food with an artist's eye. Just Emmy, whose grandmother had taught her that sharing a meal was the most sacred form of human connection. She reached into her trunk and pulled out the glass vial. She had not touched it in weeks. The pills inside had started to discolor, slightly losing their potency in the dry Wyoming air. She held it up to the dim light filtering through the barn windows. "If I'm going to teach them about my culture," she whispered to herself in Japanese, "I need to be alive to do it." She still did not throw the vial away. Not yet. But she placed it back in the trunk, buried beneath the extra blankets and the drawing she had made on Jack's paper. Hidden but no longer carried close to her heart. No longer the first thing she touched when she woke and the last thing she felt before sleep. Tomorrow they would begin planning the sushi lesson. Tomorrow they would figure out how to transform Wyoming trout into something resembling the ocean fish of home. Tomorrow they would teach their former enemies that food could be art, that care and precision mattered, that culture survived even when countries fell. But tonight Emmy lay down under her warm blankets and allowed herself to think about the future. Not with hope, exactly. Hope seemed too dangerous, too likely to be crushed. But with possibility. With the small, fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, surviving was not the same as surrendering. That choosing to live even in this impossible place among these impossible people was not a betrayal of those who had died. It was perhaps the only way to honor them, to carry forward the beauty they had created, the traditions they had cherished, the humanity they had insisted on maintaining even when the world descended into madness. Her grandmother had taught her to respect every grain of rice, to find grace in simple things, to create beauty not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Outside, the Wyoming stars blazed in a sky so clear and vast, it seemed to contain the entire universe. Inside, 37 women slept beneath blankets given by people who owed them nothing. And in a trunk at the foot of one cot, a glass vial grew lighter with each passing day, its contents slowly losing their power over a young woman who was learning slowly and painfully that there were many different kinds of courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply choose to wake up tomorrow and try again. January 23rd, 1946. Colonel Wade arrived at the ranch with new orders that would fundamentally change the dynamic of their captivity. The Army had decided that the Japanese women prisoners should contribute labor to justify the expense of their maintenance. The work would be voluntary but encouraged. Those who participated would receive small credits that might eventually be converted to funds upon their release. More importantly, the work would give them purpose during the long, uncertain months ahead. Wade outlined various tasks available on the ranch: mending equipment, kitchen duties, laundry, basic animal care, and light agricultural preparation for spring planting. The women stood in formation as she spoke, their faces carefully neutral, but Emmy felt something stir inside her chest. Work meant movement. Work meant time passing with purpose instead of the endless, empty hours of waiting. The other women found their own paths through labor. Ayumi Kimura had steady hands and a calm presence that made Martha Harper trust her in the ranch house kitchen almost immediately. Within weeks, Ayumi was baking bread that rivaled anything Martha had produced in 40 years of ranch life. The smell of fresh loaves filled the house each morning, a scent that crossed cultural boundaries and spoke directly to something fundamental about home and comfort. Hana Fujimoto approached the ranch's broken machinery with the same methodical precision she had once applied to naval communications equipment. She could look at an engine that had defeated 3 different ranch hands and diagnose the problem within minutes. Daniel watched her work one afternoon, saw how her fingers traced wiring and connections with absolute confidence, and realized that intelligence and skill had nothing to do with which side of a war you fought on. Jim Patterson, mucking out stalls beside Emmy one cold February morning, began teaching her the English words for everything they touched: pitchfork, hay, water trough, bridle. His voice was patient, the same tone he had used teaching his own grandchildren before they moved to California. Emmy repeated the words carefully, her accent thick, but her memory sharp. In return, she taught him to count in Japanese. Ichi ni san shi go. The old man's pronunciation was terrible, but his smile was genuine. These small exchanges built something neither group could have articulated, a foundation of shared humanity that had nothing to do with governments or flags or the terrible things human beings had done to each other in the name of victory. It had everything to do with two people trying to understand each other across a gap that should have been unbridgeable. But the fragile peace was about to shatter. On February 10, 1946, a military jeep pulled up to the ranch, its engine cutting through the quiet afternoon like a knife. Sergeant William Crawford stepped out. 45 years old, ramrod straight eyes like flint. He had been assigned by the Army Inspection Division to evaluate POW facilities throughout the western states. Colonel Wade introduced him to Daniel with visible tension in her shoulders. Crawford had lost 2 sons, James 22 at Iwo Jima in February 1945, Robert 19 at Okinawa in June of the same year. His wife Sarah had died of a heart attack 6 months after receiving the second telegram, but everyone who knew the family understood it was grief that killed her. Now Crawford had nothing left but regulations and a burning need to make anyone accountable for the holes in his life. His first inspection of the barn was thorough and silent. He walked between the cots with his clipboard noting every detail: the extra blankets, the small personal items some women had been allowed to keep, the drawings Emmy had made now pinned to the wall near her sleeping area. The women stood at attention, faces carefully blank, but Emmy saw how Crawford's hands shook slightly when he wrote his notes. After the inspection, he spoke with Daniel outside the barn, his voice low but carrying in the cold air. Mr. Harper, these prisoners appear to be receiving treatment beyond standard protocols. Daniel kept his own voice calm. They are working to earn their keep, Sergeant. Geneva Convention allows for compensated labor. Crawford's jaw tightened. I am familiar with the convention. I am also familiar with the enemy's treatment of our boys. My sons did not get extra blankets in their POW camps. They got bamboo cages and starvation rations. The words hung between them like a physical presence. Daniel understood grief. He carried his own for Billy every single day. But he had learned something in the months since these women arrived. That revenge did not bring the dead back. That cruelty inflicted on the helpless did not balance the scales of suffering. That sometimes the only way to honor those who died was to refuse to become what killed them. I am sorry for your loss, Sergeant Daniel said quietly. Truly sorry, but these women did not build those bamboo cages. Crawford's face remained impassive. I will be filing a preliminary report with recommendations. Some of these women appear to be security risks receiving inappropriate preferential treatment. There are facilities better equipped for stricter oversight. The threat was clear. Crawford wanted them transferred to a harsher camp, wanted them punished for crimes they may or may not have committed, punished simply for being Japanese, for being alive when his sons were dead. After Crawford left, Martha found Daniel standing alone near the stable. That man is hurting, she said softly. Hurt people, Mama. We need to be careful. Jack joined them, his young face worried. You think he will really try to move them? Daniel watched the dust from Crawford's Jeep settle on the distant road. I think he will try everything in his power, and we need to be ready. Emmy had overheard enough of the conversation to understand the danger. Her English had improved enough to grasp the essential truth. There was a man who wanted to take them away from this place. A man who looked at them and saw only enemies, only targets for the rage he could not direct at anyone else. That night she went to her trunk and took out the glass vial, held it in her palm, felt its familiar weight. Maybe Lieutenant Sato was right, she whispered in Japanese. Maybe some shames are worse than death. But she did not open the vial. Not yet. Because tomorrow Rosie would need grooming. Because Ayumi was teaching her to bake bread next week. Because Jack had given her paper and pencil, expecting nothing in return. Because choosing death felt less like honor and more like letting the hatred win. 4 days later, on February 14th, the mail courier arrived from Denver. Colonel Wade sorted through the stack of envelopes with growing somber attention. 23 letters for the Japanese women prisoners routed through international Red Cross channels and military censors. After months of absolute silence, after months of not knowing, some of them would finally learn what had become of their families. The anticipation in the barn that evening was almost unbearable. Women who had maintained perfect stoic composure for 4 months began to show cracks in their armor. Hands trembled, eyes darted toward the stack of letters Wade held. Some prayed silently, others sat frozen, afraid to hope and afraid not to. Keiko received 3 letters more than anyone else. Her hands shook as she opened the first from a cousin who had survived the firebombing of Tokyo. The letter was brief, factual, devastating. Her parents had died in the March 1945 raid that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Her younger sister had survived, but was living in a refugee camp with inadequate food and shelter. Her brother's status remained unknown. He had been stationed in Manchuria when the Soviets invaded. Keiko read the letter twice, her face perfectly still. Then she carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket. She did not cry. Not yet. Not where others could see. But Emmy, sitting beside her, felt her friend's body shaking with the effort of containing something too large to be held inside human skin. Emmy's own letter arrived forwarded multiple times through various military channels. The envelope was worn soft from handling the ink on the address, smudged and faded. It was from an aunt in Osaka who had somehow survived the conventional bombing raids that destroyed most of that city. She opened it with fingers that had gone numb, read the carefully written characters, read them again because her brain refused to process the meaning. Read them a third time because surely she had misunderstood. Your honorable parents and younger brother were in Hiroshima visiting relatives in early August 1945. The aunt's handwriting was shaky but precise. They were among the estimated 200,000 people killed by the new weapon and its aftermath. Your older brother Takeshi died in the Philippines in 1944. I am the last surviving member of our family. I am writing this from a hospital. The doctors say I have radiation sickness from searching for survivors in the ruins. I am sorry to burden you with this news. I am sorry for everything. The letter continued, but Emmy could not read further. Her vision had narrowed to a single point. Everyone is dead. Everyone. Her parents who had worried about her joining the Navy. Her younger brother Hiroshi, who had wanted to be a teacher. Her older brother Takeshi, who had written her letters about his dreams of studying engineering after the war. Her grandmother who had taught her to paint. All of them gone, vaporized or burned or slowly dying of radiation poisoning. And her aunt, the woman who wrote this letter, was dying too. Emmy was the last Nakamura alive, the last person who would remember her grandmother's laugh or her mother's lullabies, or the way her father had insisted on perfect posture at dinner. The last keeper of memories that would die with her. 14 women received no letters at all. The silence was in some ways worse than devastating news. It meant uncertainty, the torture of not knowing whether to hope or grieve. Hana Fujimoto sat on her cot, staring at nothing, her practical hands idle for once. Her family had lived in Nagasaki. The complete absence of any words suggested the worst. But without confirmation, she existed in a painful limbo between hope and despair. That night, the ranch hands heard sounds from the barn they had not heard before. Not the muffled crying of early captivity, but open, unrestrained grief. Women who had maintained rigid composure for months finally broke under the weight of confirmed loss. Keiko wept for parents she would never bury properly. Ayumi sobbed for siblings scattered or dead. Others cried for futures that would never exist, for homes that were ash, for a country that had been willing to sacrifice them all. Jack Harper stood outside on guard duty, listening to the sounds of heart-shattering, and found tears running down his own weathered face. He thought of Billy dead on a beach somewhere in the Pacific, thought of his mother's grief that had eventually hardened into something that allowed her to survive. War created these losses on both sides, he realized. The women in that barn were grieving the same war that took Billy, just from the other direction. Inside the barn, Emmy sat on her cot with the letter still clutched in her shaking hands. She reached into her trunk with her free hand and pulled out the glass vial. Lieutenant Sato's voice echoed in her memory. Die with honor rather than live in shame. But what honor? Everyone who could have been dishonored by her survival was dead. What shame? There was no one left to shame. The vial sat in her palm, small glass final, in answer to a question she had been carrying for 127 days. How do you live when everyone you love is gone? How do you wake up tomorrow when tomorrow means nothing but more grief? How do you justify being alive when so many deserved life more than you? The pill would end it, 30 seconds, and she would be with her family. Or nowhere. It did not matter which. Either was better than this. At 3:17 in the morning on February 15, 1946, Emi Nakamura stood outside the barn in freezing darkness. Stars above Wyoming shone impossibly bright, impossibly indifferent to the small tragedies of human beings so far below. She held the vial in her right hand and her aunt's letter in her left. Everyone is dead, she whispered in Japanese. I am alone. There is no one left to dishonor, no one left to return to. She raised the vial to her lips. The glass was cold against her skin. Her hand trembled, but her resolve felt solid. She opened her mouth, tilted her head back, and heard a faint whinny from the stable. Rosie, the chestnut mare. The sound broke through Emmy's trance like a stone through ice. She lowered her hand, looked toward the dark bulk of the stable building. The mare whinnied again as if calling her. And suddenly, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Her grandmother's voice from childhood. Emmy-chan, when you feel lost, remember you are not just you. You carry everyone who came before. Their strength is your strength. Their love is your love. You are never truly alone. Her grandmother teaching her to draw horses. See how the horse breathes, Emmy-chan. That breath is life. Never waste life, never. Emmy looked at the vial in her hand, looked at the stable. Rosie whinnied a third time, insistent, demanding. Tomorrow Rosie would need grooming. Tomorrow Martha was teaching her to bake bread. Tomorrow Jack would show her how to repair tack. Tomorrow Daniel wanted to plan the sushi lesson. Tomorrow existed whether she chose to see it or not. I cannot, she whispered. I cannot. Not because of honor or shame or duty to the dead, but because Rosie needed her, because bread needed baking, because somewhere in this impossible place, she had begun to matter to people who had no obligation to care whether she lived or died, and they mattered to her. She walked to the well in the center of the compound, held the vial over the dark opening, released her fingers, heard a faint splash as it hit water far below. Gone. Final. Irreversible. She sank to her knees in the frozen dirt and cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Cried for her parents and brothers. Cried for her grandmother and aunt. Cried for the girl she had been before the war, taught her what hatred looked like, cried for all the futures that would never exist. Jack Harper was walking the perimeter on guard duty when he saw her collapse. He heard the sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs, older than language. He did not approach, did not speak, just stood at a respectful distance, keeping watch, making sure she was safe. When she finally stood on shaking legs, wiped her face with frozen hands, and walked back to the barn, he nodded once, though she could not see him in the darkness. "Good," he whispered. "Live." Morning came. Emmy woke exhausted but different. The weight in her pocket was gone. The guilt remained sharp and constant, but no longer crushing. She had chosen life, not because she deserved it, not because it was honorable, but because somewhere between November and February, between the first blanket and the last letter, she had found small reasons to continue, and small reasons she was learning were enough. 2 months passed. Winter gave way to spring with startling speed. The prairie transformed from brown to impossible green almost overnight. On April 20th, 1946, the kitchen in the ranch house had been transformed into an unlikely classroom. Emmy Keiko and 5 other women stood at the large wooden table while Daniel, Jack, Jim Patterson, and 3 younger ranch hands watched with genuine curiosity. Martha had provided ingredients from the ranch stores. The women had spent 2 days preparing what they could, adapting traditional recipes to Wyoming resources with creativity that bordered on invention. Jack had spent an entire day fishing mountain streams, returning with a dozen rainbow trout. The fish were different from ocean varieties, but fish was fish, and these were remarkably fresh and clean tasting. Without nori seaweed, they used tender lettuce leaves from Martha's cold frame garden. Without pickled ginger, they pickled radishes and carrots using techniques that predated the war. Without wasabi, Hana experimented with horseradish from the root cellar, grinding it fresh and mixing it with a touch of mustard powder. The result was hotter, less refined, but served a similar purpose. As the women assembled the various components, they fell into a rhythm that transcended language. Emmy shaped rice into small oblongs with hands that remembered the motion even after years away from home. Ayumi laid delicate pieces of trout across the rice, adjusting each piece until the presentation satisfied her sense of balance. Keiko arranged the pickled vegetables in patterns that pleased the eye as much as they would please the palate. The act of creation became meditation, a connection to skills and traditions that the war had tried to erase. The ranch hands watched in fascinated silence. They had expected something strange, perhaps unpalatable. Instead, they were witnessing artistry. Jim Patterson, who had butchered countless cattle in his decades on the ranch, recognized the precision and care in the women's knife work. Jack noticed how Emmy's movements had the same focused grace he had observed in her horse grooming. Daniel saw his mother watching with tears in her eyes, moved by the sight of these women creating beauty from limited resources, maintaining dignity through craft. But as the lesson reached its climax, as the ranch hands began to taste the improvised sushi with cautious appreciation, Hannah glanced out the window and her face went pale. "That Jeep," she said quietly in Japanese. "It is back." Sergeant Crawford had returned for his follow-up inspection. He entered the kitchen without knocking, his face hardening as he took in the scene. Prisoners receiving cooking lessons, prisoners laughing, prisoners being treated like guests instead of enemies. "Colonel Wade will hear about this," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Prisoners are not supposed to be receiving cooking lessons. They are supposed to be working." Daniel stepped forward, his own voice calm but firm. "They are working, Sergeant. Teaching is work." Crawford's face flushed. "Teaching the enemy our hospitality while they teach us theirs. My sons did not get cooking lessons in their bamboo cages." He turned to leave, his movements sharp with fury, but he did not see the bucket of ice water that someone had left by the door. His boot caught the rim. The bucket tipped. Crawford slipped, his feet going out from under him, and fell hard. His head struck the edge of the wooden table with a sickening crack. Blood began to pool on the floor. He did not move. The kitchen erupted in chaos. Jack rushed forward. Jim froze in place. Daniel knelt beside the fallen man, checking for breath, for pulse. Is he dead? Someone whispered. Hana Fujimoto pushed through the crowd. Move, she said in clear English. Now. She knelt beside Crawford, her hands moving with absolute confidence. Former Naval Medical Corps, she had treated combat injuries under fire. A head wound in a kitchen was nothing compared to what she had seen. She checked his pulse, his breathing, the extent of the bleeding. He is alive, she said calmly. Head wound, possible concussion. I need clean cloth, hot water medical kit. For the next 10 minutes, Hannah worked with steady hands, cleaned the wound, applied pressure, determined there was no skull fracture but a significant laceration that would require stitches, all while Crawford remained unconscious, all while the ranch hands watched a Japanese woman saving the life of a man who wanted to destroy them. When Crawford's eyes finally opened, confused and disoriented, he saw Hannah's face above him, recoiled instinctively. What he started to say. You fell, Hannah said in her careful English. Hit head, ice sutured wound. You need rest observation for 24 hours. Crawford tried to sit up. The world spun violently. Jack and Daniel helped him to the couch in the living room. Martha brought blankets, and Crawford lay there on his enemy's couch, saved by his enemy's hands, trying to process what had happened. That night, Crawford stayed at the ranch house. The nearest doctor was 2 hours away, and moving him seemed unwise. Hannah checked on him every few hours, monitoring for signs of concussion, changing the dressing on his wound. He did not speak to her, just watched with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and something else. Shame, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. In the barn, Emmy lay on her cot, thinking about what she had witnessed. Hannah had saved Crawford's life without hesitation, had treated him with the same care she would have given anyone, had proven that skill and compassion did not depend on which side of a war you fought. And Crawford, lying on a couch surrounded by people he had wanted to punish, now owed his life to one of them. Will it change anything? Keiko whispered in the darkness. Emmy did not know, but she thought about the vial at the bottom of the well, thought about choosing to live when death would have been easier, thought about bread and horses and paper and pencil and all the small kindnesses that had kept her alive. Maybe it changes nothing. She whispered back, or maybe it changes everything. We will not know until tomorrow. And tomorrow, as it turned out, would bring news that would force every woman in that barn to make an impossible choice, to return to a homeland that no longer wanted them, or to stay with enemies who had somehow become something else entirely. May 3rd, 1946. Colonel Wade arrived at the ranch carrying newspapers, her face grave, in a way that made the women's hearts sink before she said a word. Life magazine and the Saturday Evening Post had published extensive photographic essays documenting the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images were stark, unflinching, showing devastation on a scale that defied comprehension. The women gathered around the publications in the barn's common area, their faces reflecting growing horror as they absorbed each page. Entire cities reduced to flattened wastelands, shadows of human beings burned into concrete, survivors with injuries that seemed incompatible with continued life. The photographs spoke a language beyond words, beyond translation, beyond anything the human mind was prepared to process. Emmy stared at an aerial photograph of Hiroshima taken months after the bombing. She tried to locate familiar landmarks, the castle where she had visited as a child, the rivers that wound through the city, the districts where her family had been visiting. Nothing remained recognizable. The entire city had been erased and replaced with a nightmare landscape of ash and rubble. Her aunt's letter had described the destruction, but words could not convey what these photographs showed. This was where her parents and brother had died. This was the weapon that ended the war. This was what human beings had done to other human beings in the name of victory. The scale of it made individual grief seem almost insignificant. How could she mourn two people when 200,000 had died in an instant? Keiko sat with her own set of newspapers reading accounts of the firebombing campaigns that had preceded the atomic attacks. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Dozens of cities systematically destroyed by incendiary bombs designed to create firestorms in residential neighborhoods built primarily of wood and paper. The statistics were numbing. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions homeless. The articles quoted American military officials defending the strategy as necessary to end the war and save American lives. They also quoted Japanese survivors describing nights when the sky itself seemed to be on fire. Hana finally received confirmation about her family in Nagasaki. A follow-up article listed neighborhoods that had been completely destroyed. Her family's district was among them. The uncertainty that had tortured her for months resolved into the terrible clarity of confirmed loss. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, staring at the page without blinking. Someone touched her shoulder gently. She did not respond. That evening, Jack found Emmy sitting outside the barn, staring at the Wyoming sunset. She held one of the newspaper pages creased from repeated folding and unfolding. He sat down at a respectful distance, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy with things neither knew how to say. After a long moment, Emmy spoke in halting English. "Your brother, he died fighting my country." Jack nodded slowly. "At Guadalcanal." Emmy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry." Jack looked at her. This young woman who had lost everything, who worked with his horses every day with quiet dedication, who had chosen to live when death would have been easier. He believed her sorrow was genuine. "I am sorry too," he said quietly, "for all of it." They sat together in silence as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Two people on opposite sides of a war that had ended but somehow continued in the grief they both carried. 3 days later, on May 6th, Colonel Wade's Jeep pulled up to the ranch with 2 passengers instead of 1. The second passenger was Sergeant Crawford, recovered enough from his head injury to travel. He had been convalescing at the base hospital for the past 2 weeks. Now he had returned, and the women did not know whether to feel relief or dread. Wade stood before the assembled women with official repatriation documents in her hands. Her voice was formal, almost apologetic. "Repatriation procedures will begin within the month. Transportation will be arranged to ships bound for occupied Japan. You will be allowed to return home." The words should have brought relief, should have brought joy. Instead, they brought a crisis that had kept the women awake through long nights of whispered debate. What did home mean now? The Japan they left no longer existed. Cities were ruins, families were dead or scattered. The country itself was occupied by the same American forces that now guarded them in Wyoming. Keiko had been researching conditions in occupied Japan through newspapers and Red Cross reports. She had shared what she learned with the other women in their evening gatherings. Food was scarce, widespread malnutrition, and even starvation in some areas. Housing was critically limited, with millions homeless. The economy had collapsed. Inflation had made currency nearly worthless. Women faced particular dangers in the chaos of occupation. Reports of assault and exploitation. And women returning from American captivity would face social stigma. They would be viewed as failures, as soldiers who had surrendered rather than die for the emperor. The same judgment that had once made Emmy carry a poison pill now waited for them in their homeland. They could not win. Dying would have made them martyrs. Living made them cowards. But before anyone could process the repatriation announcement, Crawford stepped forward. Everyone tensed, expecting condemnation, expecting the harsh report that would justify transferring them to a harsher facility. Instead, Crawford cleared his throat and began to read from a paper in his shaking hands. "After extensive observation and one unexpected personal experience, I am compelled to revise my preliminary assessment. The Japanese women prisoners at Harper Ranch have demonstrated exemplary conduct, productive work contribution, and in at least one documented case, life-saving medical intervention that exceeded all expectations of prisoner behavior. Furthermore, their presence has had measurable positive impact on facility morale and community relations." His voice cracked slightly. He paused, took a breath, continued. While my personal losses make objectivity difficult, I cannot in good conscience recommend transfer to alternative facilities when current arrangement appears to serve interests of both military and humanitarian objectives. These women have earned the right to complete dignity in their repatriation process. The paper trembled in his hands. He signed it April 28, 1946. Silence filled the barn. Every woman stared at Crawford, unable to believe what they had just heard. This man who had wanted to punish them, who had looked at them with such hatred, who had every reason to make their lives harder, he had saved them instead. Hannah's eyes were wide, disbelieving. Crawford met her gaze and nodded once. I owe you my life, ma'am. That is not a debt I take lightly. But Wade was not finished. That is not why I asked Sergeant Crawford to come today, she said. He wanted to tell you something before you make your decision about repatriation. Crawford spoke directly to the assembled women, his voice rough with emotion barely contained. For 2 years, I have blamed every Japanese person alive for my son's deaths. I wanted revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted someone to hurt as much as I hurt. He looked at Hannah again. Then you saved my life. You did not have to. After everything I said, everything I tried to do to you, you could have let me bleed out on that kitchen floor. No one would have blamed you. The truth of it hung in the air. Hannah could have let him die, could have stood back and watched, could have called it justice for James and Robert and all the other sons who died in Pacific cages. I do not know if I can ever fully forgive what happened to my boys, Crawford continued. But I learned something from you women. Mercy does not erase the past. It does not make the pain go away. But it gives us a chance to build something different in the future. He paused, gathering himself. Whatever you decide, stay or go, you deserve to make that choice freely. Not as prisoners, as human beings who have earned the right to determine your own futures. Wade stepped forward, which brings me to something unprecedented. The United States government is prepared to offer an alternative to immediate repatriation. Every head turned towards her. Emmy's heart began to pound. You can be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons, Wade explained, released from military custody. But you will need individual sponsorships from American citizens or organizations. These sponsors will assume financial responsibility and vouch for your character. If sponsorships can be arranged, you will be granted temporary residency with the possibility of applying for permanent immigration status after 2 years. The conditions were daunting. Each woman would need to find an American family or organization willing to take legal and financial responsibility for her, would need to secure employment and housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals, would be subject to regular monitoring by immigration officials, and could be deported if they violated any terms of their residency. But despite the challenges, it was a chance. It was more than any of them had dared hope for. May 18, 1946. Spring had fully arrived on the Wyoming prairie, bringing warmth and the impossible green of new grass. The landscape's transformation seemed to mock the women's internal turmoil. Colonel Wade stood before them with official documents ready to process their repatriation decisions. She began calling names. Each woman was to step forward when called, acknowledge understanding and acceptance of the repatriation order. The first 10 names were called. 10 women stepped forward without hesitation. They would return to Japan, would face whatever waited there with the same courage that had brought them this far. Then Wade called Emmy Nakamura. Emmy remained motionless. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The barn seemed to shrink around her. Wade paused, looked at her with raised eyebrows, repeated the name. Emmy took a deep breath, spoke in careful English she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. Colonel Wade, I request permission to make a statement. Wade's expression shifted to surprise, but she nodded. Emmy stepped forward. Keiko moved to stand beside her, then Hana joined them. Then Ayumi, then 7 others. 11 women in total standing together in a line that separated them from their fellow prisoners. The barn fell absolutely silent. Keiko spoke, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to say. Colonel, we have discussed our situation at length. We understand we are prisoners of war and that repatriation is standard procedure. However, we wish to respectfully request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Japan at this time. The words fell like stones into still water. Wade's professional composure cracked her mouth, opening slightly in disbelief. The other women in the barn began speaking rapidly in Japanese, their voices rising in shock and confusion. Some sounded angry, others bewildered. Tomoko Hayashi stepped forward, one of the women who would return. Her face was flushed. She spoke in Japanese, her words sharp. You would abandon our country after everything you choose to stay with the enemy. Keiko responded in Japanese, her tone respectful but firm. We are not abandoning anything. We are choosing to survive and perhaps to heal. The Japan we return to does not want us. We would be burdens at best, outcasts at worst. Wade raised her hand for silence. She needed to understand the situation before it escalated further. She asked Emmy to explain their reasoning. Emmy spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. Many of us have no families to return to, no homes, no means of support. We have read the reports about conditions in occupied Japan. We know the stigma we would face as returned prisoners. She paused, searching for the words to articulate something deeper. Here in Wyoming, we have been treated with unexpected dignity. We have found purpose in work. We have been allowed to contribute and learn and grow. We have been given a chance to become more than just defeated soldiers. We do not reject Japan. We honor it by choosing to live fully wherever that life can flourish. Daniel Harper stood at the back of the room. He found himself nodding slowly. These women had earned the right to choose their own futures. Tomoko's voice carried pain that cut deeper than anger. My entire family died in the Tokyo firebombing. I feel their deaths demand I return to honor their memory by helping rebuild what was lost. It was valid, understandable, honorable. Emmy's response was equally valid. And my family died in Hiroshima. I feel their deaths demand I live fully wherever that is possible because they cannot. Both choices carried weight. Both required courage. Both honor the dead in different ways. Wade's face showed the strain of processing something no regulation had prepared her for. This is unprecedented. I will need to communicate with Washington. It may take several weeks to receive authorization. In the meantime, those who wish to request sponsorship should understand this path will not be easy. You will face scrutiny, suspicion, potential rejection. Are you certain? The 11 women stood firm. Emmy spoke for all of them. We are certain. The response from the surrounding community exceeded all expectations. Within days of the decision becoming, public offers of sponsorship began to arrive. The Harper family immediately stepped forward to sponsor Emmy. Daniel explained that she had proven invaluable in working with the horses and that the ranch could use a permanent employee with her skills and work ethic. Martha added that Emmy had become like a daughter to her, filling a void left by Billy's death in ways she had not anticipated. Reverend William Harrison and his wife Margaret offered to sponsor Keiko, recognizing her language skills and education as assets that could serve their church's outreach programs. Dr. Robert Hayes, who had supervised Ayumi's medical work at the ranch, arranged sponsorship through Cheyenne General Hospital with the intention of helping her pursue nursing certification. Within 10 days, all 11 women had secured sponsorships. Local families inspired by newspaper coverage and sermons about Christian duty stepped forward with offers of support. Even Crawford quietly wrote letters of recommendation for several women, vouching for their character, in words that carried weight with both military and civilian authorities. But the joy of acceptance was tempered by the pain of separation. The 26 women who had chosen repatriation would leave as scheduled. Women who had spent months together in captivity, who had supported each other through devastating losses and uncertain futures, would now part ways. perhaps forever. The final week before the repatriation transport arrived was filled with quiet farewells and promises to write. On the last evening, Tomoko approached Emmy outside the barn. They sat together as the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomoko spoke in Japanese, her voice soft. I do not know if you are making the right choice, but I understand why you are making it. Take care of yourself, Imi-san. Try to find happiness here. Emmy felt tears streaming down her face as she bowed deeply. Help rebuild our homeland, Tomoko-san. Make it into something worthy of those we lost. They exchanged small gifts. Emmy gave Tomoko the first drawing she had made with Jack's paper, a horse standing in prairie grass. Remember that kindness exists, she said. Tomoko gave Emmy a small cloth she had embroidered with a chrysanthemum pattern. Remember where you come from. The morning the trucks arrived, 26 women boarded with their possessions in small bundles. They stood straight, maintained military bearing even now. The 11 women who were staying lined up to say goodbye. Keiko addressed them in formal Japanese, thanking them for their service, their strength, their sacrifice. We take different paths, but we walk them with the same honor. The trucks pulled away, dust rising in their wake. The women remaining watched until the dust settled. Then they turned back to the barn, to the ranch, to the lives they were choosing, felt the weight of that choice settle over their shoulders. No going back now. The following months transformed the 11 women from prisoners into something else entirely. They were released from military custody, moved from the barn to various homes and facilities in Cheyenne and the surrounding area, began new lives as displaced persons with the fragile protection of sponsorship. Emmy moved to a small cabin on the Harper Ranch property. She worked full-time with the horses, and Daniel quickly recognized her natural talent. He sent her to training courses. Within a year, she had become one of the most skilled horse trainers in Wyoming, earning respect from the ranching community through quiet dedication and undeniable ability. Her relationship with Jack Harper developed slowly, built on shared work and comfortable silences. They mended fences together, fed horses together, sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the prairie. In the spring of 1948, Jack asked her a question he had been rehearsing for months. I have been thinking about asking you something, he said quietly. What is that, Emmy replied. Whether you might consider staying here, permanently, with me. Emmy looked at him. This quiet man who had given her paper when she had nothing, who had taught her the names of everything on the ranch with patient repetition, who had stood guard the night she threw the poison pill into the well, keeping watch without ever mentioning what he had witnessed. I already decided to stay, Jack, she said. I mean, as my wife. The words hung in the air between them. Emmy thought about Martha, about whether she would approve. Jack seemed to read her mind. My mother already asked me why I was taking so long to ask you. That evening, Emmy approached Martha nervously. Martha took her hands without hesitation. You brought light back to this house when we thought it was gone forever. You honor Billy's memory by choosing life. I would be proud to call you daughter. They married in September 1949 in Reverend Harrison's church. Some community members attended, some boycotted. It did not matter. Emmy became Emmy Harper. Keiko served as maid of honor. Crawford attended, sitting in the back, nodding his approval from a distance. The other women's paths diverged but remained connected. Keiko became director of Reverend Harrison's International Outreach Program, helping hundreds of refugees and immigrants navigate American society. Ayumi earned her medical degree and ran a clinic serving immigrant communities in Denver. Hana married an engineer, raised 3 children, while working as a State Department translator. Letters from Japan arrived regularly. Tomoko wrote of Japan's remarkable recovery, the economic miracle transforming the devastated nation. She had become a teacher in rebuilt Tokyo, educating students about the importance of cultural exchange and international understanding. Her letters described a shift in values she attributed partly to returning soldiers who had experienced unexpected kindness during captivity. September 7, 1966. 20 years since that impossible summer when 11 Japanese women chose to remain in Wyoming rather than return to their defeated homeland. Emmy Nakamura Harper, now 44 years old, stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she now owned, teaching her 14-year-old daughter, Sarah, how to prepare sushi using the same improvised techniques she had first demonstrated to Jack's father, Daniel, 2 decades earlier. The rainbow trout came from the same mountain streams. The pickled vegetables came from Martha's garden, which Emmy had maintained and expanded after her mother-in-law's death 5 years earlier. Sarah's hands moved with the confidence of a girl raised between two cultures, shaping rice with practiced ease, while asking about a letter that had arrived that morning from Japan. The letter was from Tomoko Hayashi Suzuki, who wrote regularly, maintaining a correspondence that had lasted 2 decades. This letter was special. Tomoko described attending a conference on Japanese-American relations in Tokyo. Several other women who had been repatriated from American camps attended, sharing similar stories of unexpected kindness during captivity. "We have become, in a way, ambassadors of reconciliation," Tomoko wrote, "living proof that former enemies can find common ground. But here is what I must tell you, Emi-san. For years, I believed my choice to return was the only honorable path. I judged your decision to stay as abandonment. I was wrong." The letter continued. "This week, I met a young American student studying in Tokyo. Her grandmother was a POW in America. She stayed like you. This student came to Japan to learn her heritage, to bridge the gap, to carry forward the understanding her grandmother began. I understand now. Both our choices were right. You healed the wounds from your side of the ocean. I healed them from mine. Together, our different paths created something neither of us could have built alone. The bridges we built are strong enough now for the next generation to cross freely." Sarah was quiet for a moment after her mother finished reading. Then she asked the question every generation must ask about the previous one's conflicts. "Mom, at school, some kids asked why you stayed here instead of going back to Japan after the war. I did not know what to tell them." Emi set down her knife, looked at her daughter. "When the war ended, I faced a choice. Return to a homeland that no longer existed, where I would be seen as a failure for surviving when others died, or stay in a place where I had been enemy, but where people chose to see me as a human being first." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Neither choice was easy. Neither was wrong. I chose to stay because I believed I could do more good here, building bridges from this side. Tomoko chose to return because she believed the same about Japan. We were both right." "But how did you forgive them?" Sarah asked. "How did you stop seeing them as the enemy?" Emi's answer came from 20 years of living the question. "I never forgave the war. War is unforgivable. But the people were different. Your father gave me paper when I had nothing. Your grandmother fed me when I was hungry. Sergeant Crawford wrote a report that saved our lives after we saved his. These were not the actions of enemies. These were the actions of human beings choosing to be better than the war that made them." Jack Harper entered the kitchen, his hair gray now, but his smile still warm. He stole a piece of pickled radish from the preparation table, earning a mock scolding from his wife. He kissed her forehead. "Girls ready for dinner?" he asked. Sarah had one final question. "Mom, if you could go back, knowing everything that would happen, would you make the same choice?" Emmy looked at her husband, at her daughter, at the kitchen, filled with smells of both cultures blending into something new. "Every single day, I would choose this, not because it was easy, because it was real." They sat down to dinner, sushi made with mountain trout, Martha's recipe cornbread that Emmy had perfected over the years, green tea in American mugs. Conversation flowed between English and occasional Japanese words that Sarah used without thinking, the way children of two worlds do. Outside the window, the Wyoming sunset painted the prairie gold and purple. The same landscape that had looked like the end of the world to a frightened 24-year-old girl in 1945 now looked like home. Not because she had forgotten Japan, but because she had learned that home is not where you are from. Home is where you choose to build it, with people who choose to build it with you. On both sides of the ocean, in kitchens filled with sushi and cornbread, in letters traveling between former enemies who became friends, in daughters who carry both cultures forward without having to choose between them. Sarah took a bite of sushi, closed her eyes. Perfect, Mom. Just perfect. Emmy smiled, thought of her grandmother who taught her to respect every grain of rice, thought of Tomoko teaching students in Tokyo, thought of 11 women who chose to stay, 26 who chose to return, all of them ambassadors, all of them bridges, all of them survivors who had learned that the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is people choosing day after day to see each other as human beings first, to share meals across impossible divides, to build futures their children can inherit without the weight of hatred. The sun set over Wyoming. In Japan, it was rising, and somewhere between those 2 points in kitchens and classrooms, in quiet moments of grace, the work of healing continued. One meal at a time, one choice at a time, one generation learning from the last that some bridges are worth building even when the chasm seems too wide to cross, especially then.